Hi everyone, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, Connor Curtis, jumping in here to say that this week we don't have a normal podcast episode for you. What we have instead is a recording of a recent webinar that we did on how to communicate on climate change and wildfires in Canada. I think it's really interesting and it's something worth sharing here in this medium, and I hope you got a chance to tune in to learn something from it. We're also going to do something a little different this week because this is a webinar and not a normal podcast, and respond to our Q&A question at the beginning of the episode rather than at the end. On that note, so we had a previous webinar that we did on how to talk with family members, friends, and co-workers, for instance, on climate change. And we published that webinar, also published it here as a podcast. And we received a comment based on that webinar from a supporter responding to one particular aspect of the webinar. And in that webinar, the guest that we had on said to get out of fact land and get into story sharing land. And what they meant was, in the context of talking about climate change with friends and family and coworkers, get out of just sharing facts and start talking about stories about how climate change personally affects people and yourself, possibly even as well. And that's one way to bridge that gap. And so somebody did write in a comment and they said, people are not afraid of science. The truth is that many scientists do not know how to explain scientific facts to non-scientists. Facts are what science is all about. Do not get all puffy with big words and superiority. Took on over 3 decades. Stratospheric ozone depletion, acid rain, toxic chemicals, now climate change. Policymakers understood these scientific issues. They acted. The world is in desperate need of a clear case for climate action. Now starvation on a massive scale is on the horizon. Just watch. Climate change will be the course. And so I want to start off by saying that I completely understand where this commentator is coming from. I like what that thought of getting out of fact land, getting into story sharing land, but I like it not because of the idea that we would get rid of all factual conversation, which I don't think is what the presenter meant either, by the way, just to clarify. I think that what it does is get people out of the realm of just listing off scientific information as if that's going to convince people in and of itself without even thinking about that scientific information in a way that relates to those people's experience. And so what I like to talk about more than facts versus story sharing is, how do we actually frame things? What is the region in which we're talking about things? Are we thinking about our audience and like who we're chatting to and the things that concern them? Because that will shape what we say to them, whether that's facts or whether that's stories or whether that's some combination of both. And ideally, it is a combination of both. I don't think that we have to go to one side of the spectrum or the other side of the spectrum on this when it comes to saying we should be sharing only facts or we should be sharing only stories. There's a combination to be had here. And what I mean by that is that I've seen communications professionals do precisely what I think the commentator is concerned about, which is they've gone all in on emotion and storytelling and removed the facts. And I think that actually doesn't work when it's just done in isolation of the facts, because then people are left with, okay, well, you've told me this story, but what am I going to do about it? Where's the evidence for what you just said? I think that that's the problem when we go too far to that perspective. On the other hand, as you know, the commentator makes clear as well, there are people out there who maybe know the facts but don't know how to communicate those facts in a way that's actually understandable to the audience that is listening to those facts. And I actually agree with that side as well. I think we can get too into fact land, we can get too into story sharing land. There is a balance in everything that we say that we need to hit the right mark on. And that's going to be important. That's something important to think about when you're about to listen to our subsequent webinar on this topic of climate change communications. You're talking with friends and family. How do you balance facts on one hand and stories on the other hand? It should be a combination of both. We can tell personal things and emotional things and things that really motivate people emotionally in the same breath that we share factual information. And the trick with both things to truly get across the concern that we have about climate change is to think about the story that we're sharing, and does it match with the person who we're talking to? Is it going to talk to them in things they're actually concerned about? And with the facts, it's, yes, we can say that climate change is caused by CO2, but are there ways to talk about that fact in a way that the person is going to understand? It doesn't dumb it down, it doesn't make it more simple than it actually is, but that presents those facts in a way that they actually understand. It is a combination of the both. And, I have seen communications people go too far to one end or too far to the other, or make the argument that you need to use only one and not the other. And I get completely where the concern is coming from with this. I don't think that was really the point of the presenter in the webinar, was to totally disregard facts. But I do think that you're right to have a concern about, do we still use facts in communications? We absolutely should. So I hope that provides some insight on your question. Again, that's my opinion. I work in communications. There are a ton of people in communications with different opinions on that. I tend to like to take balance. I tend to think that we often, with communications work in general, try to find easy solutions that will work every time with every audience, and that's just not the way audiences work. It's just not the way that communications works. And particularly, communications has changed, right? We've seen not so much a decline in facts being important, but the very notion of facts itself being challenged as to, what is a fact? Where did it come from? Does that even matter? I think you will run into people for whom any factual evidence at this point simply isn't convincing. But at that point, you also have to ask yourself, and this is something that has come up before in our conversations, is it worth spending my time talking to that person? And I don't mean stop talking to people. I mean, if you're going to take the time to talk to other people, which is one of the biggest things you can do, by the way, in order to counter environmental misinformation, is talk to people around you about it. Talk to people about facts. Talk to people about stories on climate change, about personal impacts. It's probably the biggest impact you can have if you're listening to this in terms of countering environmental misinformation. If you're going to do that, think about time as a resource. Do not spend 10 hours, I've said this before, arguing with one person who is never going to change their mind. That is a waste of time. I'm sorry, that's very unfortunate. I think we all deal with that in our lives. I think we all have to face the person sometimes who we just can't convince. Instead, go out and spend 1 hour each talking with 10 different people who are actually on the fence. There are lots of people out there who acknowledge climate change is real. They just don't really get how serious it is. That's the perfect place to start talking with somebody, because we need people to understand just how serious it is. We need to understand how connected it is to a lot of the negative impacts we are actually seeing in our lives right now. Call out the oil and gas industry and all of the things that they have done to counter climate action. It's important to talk about climate change, yes, but it's actually important to talk about the primary cause of climate change, which has been the oil and gas industry's very shameful lobbying to delay action. And that is the primary cause of the continuing crisis in which we're in. It's something worth talking about with other people. It's something worth spending the time doing, but using that time wisely, whether you're talking about facts or stories, or as I say, ideally a combination of the two. Using that time wisely is going to make that a lot easier. So that's my advice. That's my response to the question. And with all of that being said, I am going to jump into the webinar on communicating on wildfires that we did recently. Here's an audio recording. If you'd like to listen to this recording, but with the actual slide deck there, then you can check out the link below the podcast to our Vimeo recording of this webinar that has the actual video as well. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weeklies on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.
My name is Ish Teilheimer. I'm a writer and a volunteer with Sierra Club Canada. I live in Golden Lake, Ontario, about 2 hours west of Ottawa, and I suggested the club host this event as an experiment to see if we could help members and activists become better at the art and science and techniques of persuasion, something the other side has studied carefully and invested in for decades, but our side hasn't paid a lot of attention to. Our resource person tonight, Dr. Louise Comeau, is an exception to that. As you probably know, she is a senior advisor at Reclimate, Carleton University's Center for Climate Change Communications and Public Engagement. She is also a member of the federal Net Zero Advisory Body and has more than 30 years' experience in climate change policy, communications, and solutions-related advocacy and programming. Louise homesteads in Keswick Ridge outside Fredericton, New Brunswick, and she'll be speaking from there. Tonight, Louise will talk about unique and important new national research her team has done on how to better engage non-activist segments of the Canadian population on climate change, including visually communicating wildfires. The research included a recent national survey of 6,000 Canadians and 13 focus groups. Tonight, you'll get a firsthand sense of what Louise has learned and what she and her team recommend. As mentioned, our co-host for the webinar is Jessica Murray, until recently director of Sierra Club Canada's Ontario branch. She's also Sierra Club Canada's Line 5 community organizer and a co-host of the club's podcast, The Environment in Canada. Jessica resides in so-called Toronto with her twins, who are almost 4. Jessica is organizing our session, so I will turn it over with thanks to you, Jessica, to explain the format and how things are going to go. And I'm going to thank you, Louise, Jessica, Connor, and everyone.
Thank you, Ish, and welcome everybody. I just wanted to start by inviting everybody really to arrive here. We're going to be doing a very interactive evening tonight. Louise is going to be speaking for about 15-20 minutes and sharing some really great information. And then the second half of this meeting, we're going to be doing some guided exercises. So the intention here is to really give us an opportunity to practice having conversations. For the most part, in guiding a lot of this sort of work in groups, I've found that oftentimes, even though we're working in the climate activism sphere, a lot of people just have never actually spoken about their feelings with the issue with another person and really given themselves the space to listen fully. So we're going to practice that tonight. But first off, we're going to do some deep diving with Louise, who I have learned from before, and I think her work is really, really beautiful and stunning and really interesting. So I will hand it off.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight, everyone. So very nice introduction. Thank you so much in terms of explaining what Reclimate is and what we're doing and what we're trying to make happen. And it fits very much in line with what Jessica is saying about getting in touch more with our emotional side of the climate change issue. We've got a lot of barriers up. And so let's talk a little bit about how we are processing extreme event, or as we're hearing from more and more researchers, calling them unnatural events, and under the frame of Don't Let Canada Burn. I'm going to talk a little bit about wildfires and just unusual last year it was, and give you a bit of an overview on the research that we've been doing, but also really speak to imagery. And this is probably the area that we've spent the least amount of time thinking about. But what I've learned is that when it comes to extreme events, it's actually the communication through imagery that's carrying the load, and not our words. And so that in itself is something for us to be thinking about. We'll also talk about what we've identified around trusted spokespeople in the research and the importance of wildlife imagery, and a little bit on getting our words right. Even though I'm not going to spend a lot of time on words, they're still important, as is testing them and thinking ahead about what words we'll use when. So just a few stats. This won't surprise most of you. We've all been paying attention. But when you look at this, is right off of Enercan, and stunned me when I opened up the page to see the headline, a fiery wake-up call. When Enercan starts calling wildfires a fiery wake-up call, we're in a staggering situation. And of course, it was the most destructive we've ever experienced. It wasn't just the number of fires. We've had similar numbers, but it was the staggering amount of hectares of land that were affected. And this is, the normal situation is about 2.5 million hectares of land. So just think of it, 16.5 million hectares compared to 2.5 million hectares. And the fact that it was cross country, right? From the west, from the north to the Atlantic, that itself was quite unusual. You've likely seen imagery like this too from the Enercan site. But what struck me was the quotes from Jan Boulanger, the research scientist in forest ecology. And note that I'm making reference to his degree in forest ecology because this topic is going to come up again. His view of this situation was that it was shocking, not just unprecedented, but shocking. And we've seen survey research just expressing the level of anxiety and, frankly, grief that scientists are feeling. And this very much reflects that, as you can see in the image in terms of that completely whacked out amount of territory that was affected by last year's fires. One would think that being exposed to that kind of extreme event, for many of us living in a heat wave situation at the moment, both the heat waves and the wildfires are now subjects of attribution science, noting just how the probability of the frequency and the intensity of these events is changing. You'd think that that level of experience would have an impact on public opinion in the direction of screaming for more action on climate change. Sadly, that's not the situation that we're in, believe it or not. And it is hard to believe. But the social context is one that we're all familiar with affordability and cost of living concerns, the post-COVID bounce, I'm going to call it, the rise of populism and let's just say a perspective that is more individualistic than collective. And so we have a situation where in the social context, people are distracted and they're distracted from the collective to the individual. And that's because the challenges that we're facing are pressing on their security values. When you trigger security values, you do turn to your family, to yourself. It is more individualistic. It is less collective. It's when we're feeling secure and comfortable that we feel we've got social capital to share, that we are more supportive of collective action. And that is not the moment, unfortunately, that we're in. At the same time, we've got what we call moderators, the gray psychological gaps and the misinformation and greenwashing. On the psychological gaps, believe it or not, we are still in a situation where the vast majority of Canadians believe that climate change is a problem for the future and or it's a problem of geography in other places. Even in the context of last year's wildfires, which I'll talk about in the next slide, we have a situation where these, what we call the distance gaps, the psychological gaps, as well as the social norms gap. I don't want to get too technical, but the idea here is that Canadians still are in a place, as many people around the world, where they perceive that they themselves are more supportive of climate action than they think their friends and neighbors are. And that gap can be 10, 15 points wide, which is really a lot. And that is a social norm gap. So this perception gap and this distance gap are psychological gaps that are pressing on climate change beliefs. On top of that, we've got misinformation and greenwashing that is really running rampant through social media and so on. And the unfortunate consequence is that in the last year or two, clearly in the last year, we literally have a pretty significant decline in the number of Canadians who believe that climate change is real and that it is human caused. The outcome of all of that, the social context, the distracted attention, the gaps, the greenwashing, the destabilized beliefs, is that we're seeing pretty significant declines in policy support, particularly for things like carbon price, which won't surprise anybody. But maybe a surprise is a decline in support for electrification through clean electricity regulation, as another example. So part of this challenge, and this comes from the behavioral science unit, which is an important source of information. If you don't know about it, it's housed in the Privy Council office federally. And it's packed with behavioral scientists who are amazing, just amazing. And they do really great work. And they've been measuring all sorts of climate change related aspects. And in this slide, what I'm showing you is that in their last survey, March 2023, they reported that 16 million Canadians, so 41% of Canadians, of course, this is survey based, so we're generalizing based on the size of their samples, which are very large, say they've experienced or know someone who has experienced negative impacts caused by wildfires or wildfire smoke in the past 5 years. So you'd say, well, that's everybody. That's a lot of people. That's 40% of the population. But most of that, almost all of it, is people who say they know someone. So people are experiencing wildfires and extreme events essentially through others. And people are reporting direct and indirect experiences affecting their mental health. So that's one of the most common impacts of wildfires. So 9 million Canadians at 23%. followed by evacuations, feeling that reality for people, and whether it's friends and family being evacuated. And then, of course, also exposed to negative impacts on employment when you're displaced or know someone who's displaced. So that is the context. That is just giving us the kind of the reality out there in the world. And then researchers pop in and try to understand all sorts of things. And in that context, we are partners with Eco-Analytics, a network of NGOs and other civil society groups who have come together to do public opinion research with Eric Lachapelle and Marjolaine Martel-Morin at University of Montreal. And they did a survey of 6,000 Canadians last fall, measuring climate change and social and political values and environmental behaviors, and found 5 segments of the Canadian population. I'm not going to go into that too deeply just now because we're going to do another webinar on that. We'll talk a little bit about these segments because what we find is that people who are committed to climate action represent just 15% of the population. And to be clear, we cannot win with 15% of the population. There's a second group at 21% of the population that is community focused and very concerned about climate change, almost as concerned as the first group, but much more socially conservative. So we'll come back to that as an opportunity. And then what Reclimate did was a series of 13 focus groups that were populated by people who had completed the original survey and who fell into these 5 segments. We didn't do one segment, the fossil fuel conservatives, because they're not going to be moved. That would be kind of a waste of those dollars unless I was looking for how they try to undermine climate action. In this case, I wasn't. So I was paying attention to the other 4 segments. And so each focus group had people from their own tribe. They didn't know that, but they were grouped by tribe. We tested a variety of narratives from groups like Potential Energy, Eco-Analytics, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and Climate Visuals. So there was about 90 people in these groups, and they provided incredibly important feedback on imagery, on framing, on narratives. And we also absorbed, just if you had an opportunity to see it, Potential Energy did a webinar on extreme event communication just 2 days ago that really pushes hard for all of us to be trying to rally around the idea of calling these events unnatural. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I'm really going to focus this presentation on imagery best practice. And that's because, as I've said, I really learned just how important imagery was and is to communicating extreme events. We tested wildfires, we tested heat waves, and there is guidance for imagery best practice. Let me simply say that we're not using it. Not the media, not environmental groups, not civil society groups, not Eco-Analytics, not even Reclimate yet is really getting good at following these particular principles. There's a group in the UK called climatevisuals.org, if you have not seen them before. And they've developed through their research and testing a database of imagery that meets these 7 principles, or that based on their research suggests that imagery should respect if you're trying to be effective in your communication. So the first one is obvious. You want to be showing real people. Turns out not just any old people and not just in any old way. You want to tell new stories because we're trying to engage people in stories that mean something to them, which is, again, for good communicators, not a surprise. We want to show climate change causes at scale. I would argue we also want to show solutions and impacts at scale. And I'll show you some of the examples that we used in our work. We want to show emotionally powerful impacts, and we want to obviously understand our audience. So let's say in the case of progressive activists, which are the 15% of engaged people, certain kinds of image might work better than, say, for a group called Civic Nationals, which is community-based, but more socially conservative, and they're very nature connected. They need something different. As hard as it is, we need more imagery that shows local but serious impacts. And interestingly, certainly in the UK context, and we've seen this in some other research, that protest imagery, which is often what NGOs will use in their imagery, is actually not engaging to people outside of the most engaged segments. So you might think, why is she showing me this when we're talking about wildfires? Well, I just want to show you, because we're in a heat wave, how bad it is in terms of how we communicate imagery. This image was on the CBC website just yesterday, and it just turned out that I had tested it in our focus groups. I also tested the image on the right. Both of these images are similar to what you often see when people are communicating a heat wave. And what does the public reaction look like when you ask them in focus groups? Well, of course, what do they say? This is happy times in the water, in the sun, in the fun, and does not represent heat waves, does not represent a risk in their perspective or in their opinion, and does not suggest to them that they should be concerned about heat waves, let alone climate change. On the other hand, these are not great images because I'm doing my best to find things that I think get us closer to climate visuals principles. The image on the left, let's say received well from the population in the focus group, shows a paramedic, and it shows someone being treated, looks like under duress, it looks like it's warm. And the key response from people in the focus groups was it also suggested an elderly person. And you'll see in some of the comments as I go through, not in this one, but on wildfires, that people are sensitive to the segments of the population most at risk. And in this case, when they think heat waves, they think of the concerns for the elderly, particularly because of the heat dome deaths that occurred in British Columbia. On the right-hand side, seeing people who are in a cooling center, and the fact that you see impacts at scale, all of these people not in their homes, not comfortable, lying on the floor, was very powerful to people in focus groups who never had heard of anything called a cooling center. Why is imagery, other than these great principles, why do I get a bit fixated on our inability to find good imagery or to use images that follow the climate visuals principles? Well, one of the reasons is that it can help us reduce this distance gap. This question of our perception that climate change won't affect me, it won't affect me in my lifetime or my family, and it won't affect me where I live. So these images can help us reduce that distance in terms of time and space. It can show human-focused impacts closer to home, can show impacts on nature and natural systems. But importantly, it can help build that perspective, that collective engagement perspective for people. If we can find and use images that demonstrate people engaged in healing or repair or resilience or featuring local people that we care about. And so it is about not just emotions that terrify people, but emotions that engage people in that collective action of helping each other and responding to climate change. And that starts with, sadly, what we do in extreme events. One of the pieces of analysis that really strikes me in terms of this imagery issue is that the words don't generally give us that sense of urgency, whereas the images can, particularly if we're showing real people in real time in places where we live. Now, think of the challenge, Sierra Club of Canada, national organization, Reclimate, national organization. And we're supposed to be showing people in real time in real places where we live. And so that means a lot of place-based imagery, a lot of training of photographers, a lot of care and thinking. More of us doing maybe photo contests where we use those climate visuals and get people to engage around giving us the image. And I mention it because in the focus groups, this question of showing the climate change wildfire impact at scale, right? This is one of the reactions from one of the participants where they talk about, forest fires have been part of the world since time immemorial. I get it. It's firefighters walking past an area. They're looking at the photo I'm showing them. But here at the bottom in bold, you'll see where they say, but it's affecting people's homes, lives, livestock, such as it is in that photo, which you're about to see. It's not just somewhere out in the woods. It can happen where I live. The second quote is from a woman who's really concerned about the quality of air, the air impacts from smoke, the fact that people couldn't go outside, and her own consideration about, I didn't go outside because I could get asthma. So let me take you into some of that imagery and start with how people reacted when I asked them to explain to us what they mean when they say they trust scientists. Every time we do polling now, we ask people who you trust. They say we trust scientists, but we don't really know who that is. And by the way, environmental groups have fallen to near the 3/4 of the way down that list now, with friends and family coming in second. So we have to think about how we're engaging people and who we're handing the mic to. And in this case, what people mean when they say they trust scientists. And when we're thinking about wildfires, they're actually talking about foresters, forest ecologies, back to my original quote from Enercan, wildland firefighters. And they're thinking about people who are actually personally affected by these events. And so it's not just any scientists talking about climate change generally. They want to hear about people who have frontline experience in terms of the topic or the extreme event that we are promoting understanding of. So this is the imagery that first focus group participant was talking about. I showed these as an A and B option in the focus groups. And the first thing I want to share with you is the words that were used. They're all very emotional words. I feel stressed when I see these photos. I feel anxious. I sense a tragedy. It's scary. And in the left side, we're seeing wildfire fighters. On the right is an image that I took from Climate Visuals. Again, it's not perfect, certainly not in the Canadian context necessarily, but it was the best I could do to show a home, to show smoke, to show somebody leaving their home and the impact on animals. And so in this case, here's the kinds of things that people talked about. The first thing I want to point out is it's not just about the people. People reacted strongly to the effect of wildfires on people and nature, and we shouldn't hesitate to make those points. It's specifically about health. The tightest link between wildfires and people is through health. We do well to go there first. They're having a harder time linking it to climate change, and they certainly are not linking it to fossil fuels. But in particular, this interesting group I talked about, this 21% of the Canadian population that is socially conservative, but very concerned about climate change, their pathway into the issue is actually through nature and through their love of animals. And I'll just give you a quote from this woman, Laura, who was from Alberta, who was very, very uncomfortable talking about climate change, but her heart just literally poured out of her on this one. I like them both, actually. Firefighters are personal heroes of mine, but I did like B equally because of the animals and the impact that it has on them, as well as because they're innocent. And, they're not the humans that are causing this, and they're being affected by it, and it's upsetting. I then tested these images because the first two images had limitations. People raised all sorts of reasons why they thought they were not really the best or perfect yet. So one of the issues was to try to bring more people into it, as I know from the Climate Visuals principles. Again, it was very difficult to find imagery. And so what I did was show these two vehicles evacuating and people who maybe have been evacuated. And the reaction was quite similar. Again, people kept saying, these are not really working. This one fellow from New Brunswick says, okay, they're standing there, but they're gawking. The person on the right saying, you got to combine these images in some way. And so I want to point out that if we are in a situation where we are, which is that people are not taking photos that meet all the needs that we have for communicating this issue, that we need to work with collage. And here's an example of some images that are still not yet perfect. The bottom left is from the Fort McMurray evacuation. We see the impact of wildfire on scale in terms of this mountain shot. Got wildfire fighters who are on the scene, and of course, the image of a burnt out schoolhouse. So we are at Reclimate experimenting with these collage ideas, and I encourage you to also do that as we struggle to get to a place where our images do more of the work for us than they are right now. We also, of course, have to get our words right. And there has been some research on how we should be sensitive to the timing when communicating extreme events, including wildfires. So before the event, if we know that, there's a projection or a prediction of a heat wave or wildfires, as we've seen quite a bit of this summer, that's where we can talk about the basics. It's the right time to explain the climate science. It's the right time to forewarn extreme weather events and the link to climate change, and to promote solutions and to talk about the things we need to do to prevent these events from harming and putting our safety at risk. During the events, it is a teachable moment. People are information seeking, but what's important to realize is it's not the people in the event itself. It's all those people who are experiencing the wildfire indirectly, like was identified in that survey. And that's a window of opportunity. One piece of advice we got the other day was watch Google Trends. Watch Google Trends. If people are starting to do searches for wildfire related information, That's our time. That's our moment to start getting information out. And in particular, to link climate change to the burning of fossil fuels, which that link is still weak, particularly as it leads to the second effect, which is the hotter, drier conditions leading to climate change. And then after the event is the time for us to start making sense of the events, emphasizing again the solution, climate causes and solutions, but also stepping up our advocacy in terms of promoting preparedness like Fire Smart, having a go bag by our doors in terms of the direct relationship to the event, because that's where people's minds are at. But then to keep building on this link from the event itself, protection, preparedness, and safety, to fossil fuels causing climate change and extreme events. I'm just laying out a bit of a structure for how we might create some messaging. And we're doing some more testing on this, but it is, in this context, a structure for some thinking around how we might message wildfires. I don't use the unnatural events just yet. I'm going to be testing that. But in this context, we're talking about the idea of don't let Canada burn. If we want to stem wildfires and other extreme weather, we have to act on climate change. Climate change is causing more frequent, more costly, and more deadly extreme weather year after year. This is key, the context of it. And natural disasters are taking the places we love. That is a phrase and a frame that the potential energy folks identified in their research that we want to test here in Canada. And then the cause. Climate change is caused by burning fossil fuels. Our opportunity, we can't stop all wildfires or all extreme weather, but we can stop them from getting worse. The world is making progress on climate solutions, and so is Canada, but we need to go farther, faster. And the call to action is that being serious about climate change means doing more, not less, to protect people and nature from harm, hold big polluters accountable, and to help all Canadians do our part. And I'll close by just talking about how important that third one is. In the focus groups, there was really very little efficacy on the part of Canadians in these groups, these 90 Canadians we listened to. They have no sense that Canada is a large polluter. They have no idea that we're in the top 10, pretty much whatever way you want to look at it, historical emissions and so on, per capita, oil and gas exporter and so on. And they have this perception that Canada's hard done by and that we are acting alone. And so we really do have to up our game in situating what Canada has to do in the global context and Canada's place in the world, but confidently making these comparisons to help educate Canadians about what it is that we contribute to this problem. Over and over in these focus groups, people kept talking about, oh, we're just, we're 1.5%, we're this, we're that. What we do has no impact. The idea that every ton matters, that every action we take is critical to protecting Canadians, and that global action is absolutely required. People get that Canada could eliminate its climate pollution and we would still have growing risks from wildfires. People get that. And if we ignore it, then we don't really help break through and have them hear our messaging. The other issue I mentioned at the beginning was wildfire misinformation. I just want to share with you that, as you all know, we've had an incredible amount of misinformation, disinformation in terms of wildfires. So we've got to confront that. We've got to lead with the truth in terms of the idea of a truth sandwich, but we have to describe the disinformation and counter it. We have to fact check things. And that is, I think, a critical role for environmental groups. So let me just close by giving you just a quick summary. We are in a situation beyond belief, really, but true, of unstable climate beliefs. Canada's global contribution to climate change is leading to perceptions of unfairness because people don't understand it. They're rationalizing why we don't have to do as much as we should. And there's a lot of solution skepticism and confusion. Extreme events are not linked to support for climate policies and the need to phase out fossil fuels. Our choice is, do we engage more Canadian segments in terms of these other more socially conservative Canadians? I think we can through nature, community stories and concerns. And if we did that and focused as well on not just nature protection, but preparedness, I think we could build that social mandate for climate action. And that starts with safety first, and then on to fossil fuels and the more non-adaptation related policies. I talked about this idea of the scientists who are trusted in these situations. If our groups know scientists who are in the field, let's hand them the mic. Let's get friends and family talking about how they feel. Let's apply those climate visuals principles. Let's counter wildfire misinformation and situate climate action in terms of Canada's not acting alone, and promote preparedness programming, things like Fire Smart. And I will close it there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Louise. Oh my goodness, I feel like there was so much information in there. I'm so grateful to you and all your work at Reclimate. And I want to name it like that. Practicing everything that you just said could be like a full-on career. It could be a full-on 10-week strategy session. So I'm looking at the time. We've got 20 minutes. We're going to dip a toe in. Okay. So everybody that's still in here, I know there are some people that hopped in kind of midway. So I want to kind of just mention at this point, we are going to be switching into a different format where we're going to actually start engaging with one another.
And if you'd like to participate in one of those interactive sessions at the end of our webinars, just like at the end of this one that you just listened to, be sure to sign up for email updates at sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions, events, and regular news updates that you will receive if you do that. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.